everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel YNR Daily Spoiler. Victor dropped a bombshell that changed everything. He reveals Daniel's real father.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Daily Spoiler channel. After slapping Phyllis, Victor reveals Daniel's true father. Daniel was shattered by the confession. With a practiced smile on her face, Phyllis Summers stood close to the window, her hands gripping the dress's material as though it were a lifeline. Hovering by the doorway, Daniel Romalotti, the young man who thought he belonged more with his friends and his music than with the Newmans' carved history, already felt the weight of the gathering. With a precarious calm in her posture, Nikki sat on one of the leather chairs. Because a Newman matter rarely remained truly private, Nick, Victoria, and a few others hovered just outside the close circle. They had all been invited to gather by Victor. The reason was personal and urgent. He explained over the phone in a tone that did not permit disagreement. The room became tense once everyone had gathered, as they always did when Victor wanted to be heard. Pulling a sealed envelope from his desk drawer, Victor set it down like a verdict on the polished wood. He gave Phyllis a look devoid of sympathy. "I want to make something very clear before we go any further," Victor said in a low voice sharpened by decades of leadership. "I'm not going to be blackmailed. I refuse to allow those who believe they can make money off of rumors to bring my family's name into disrepute." Phyllis's chuckle was fragile. "You always make big speeches, Victor. What is the matter at hand?" Victor remarked, "You know what it's about. You made threats to make things public and portray past errors as new realities. You attempted to use a life as leverage." Phyllis took a breath, as if she were getting ready for a rehearsed argument. "Victor, feel free to express your opinions about me. I have nothing to conceal." Victor squinted his eyes. "Yes. Then maybe you could explain why last month I had a DNA test performed by the lab. Something akin to silence descended for the first time since everyone had assembled." Daniel moved as though a slight shudder had permeated the floorboards. Phyllis had transformed into a woman wearing an armor of denial, but her face remained unchanged. "What is the DNA test?" Phyllis asked in a light-hearted manner. The envelope was slid across the desk by Victor. "This." He gave the folder's corner a tap. "This is the chain of custody. It is an independent laboratory's certified report. 2 days ago, the results were delivered by courier." "Courier?" Nikki asked again, perplexed. "Victor, what are you talking about?" Now, Victor turned to face Phyllis. "I am discussing the truth." Phyllis clenched her jaw. "What is the truth?" Victor muttered, "You accuse me of many things. You imply that I exploit people and manipulate situations to my advantage. I'm going to put an end to that story tonight." He got up, reached for the envelope, and opened it slowly and deliberately. Those who knew Victor could see the expression on his hands when he wanted to make sure everyone saw what he was doing. He pulled out one piece of official paper and raised it. "Ladies and gentlemen, the DNA results confirm that Daniel Romalotti is my biological son," Victor said, his voice hardly audible, but the room leaning in as if breath itself were rumors. Phyllis felt as though she had been released from a precipice, as the paper slipped from her grasp. Nobody in the room moved for a heartbeat. Daniel sat rigidly in the closest chair, as though the floor had attempted to pull him through it, and his knees went weak. Nick's laugh, a harsh, incredulous bark of sound, was the first sound to break the stunned silence. He said, "You're crazy. Victor, this is absurd." Victor said, "No," and the word fell like a stone. "It's not absurd." Phyllis's previously pale face turned pale white. Her expression was that of a drowning woman who was abruptly asked to explain why she hadn't yelled sooner. You can't do this to me," she uttered in a raw voice, as though a tiny thing had been thrust into the open before she could find protection. Victor placed the lab result on the desk so that everyone could see the signature and seal. He had steady fingers. "I made the choice to validate my fears. Yes, there were rumors, threads that are loose. I desired assurance. I compared the relevant samples." For Daniel, the room whirled. He gazed at Phyllis as if he were a stranger examining a self-portrait painted by someone else. Is this Decades of bewilderment were woven into his voice. Diane informed me that Danny was my father. I was raised by Danny. He was unable to complete the sentence without the world collapsing beneath him. So he stopped. In a way, Phyllis had served as his safe haven. Her face contorted as though the little framework she had erected around herself had suddenly been taken down. "Daniel," she uttered in a voice that sounded like a woman begging. She didn't say anything more. Victor moved as if he were choosing to demolish one structure after another. He moved forward one step and hit Phyllis in the face. The slap was brutal and commonplace, a man's hand on a woman's cheek that belonged in crime reports and headlines rather than in family discussions. It was not cinematic. It reverberated through the wood-paneled space like a charge, like a private law being carried out. It had the effect of making the chandelier seem to vibrate. Phyllis stumbled, one hand flying to her face, her features raw with shock. The room held its breath for a moment, a frozen scene of dismay and treachery. Nikki then advanced, reaching for Phyllis with her hands. Nick's jaw was clenched so tightly that the veins were visible, and Victoria's eyes were wide with rage. Victor didn't seem to be sorry. Even though he appeared colder, his set jaw had a look of tiredness. He uttered the words in an unpleasant whisper, "Stay out of my business. You have spent far too much time manipulating this family's emotions." Reeling, Phyllis remained silent. Her hand quivered on her cheek. Daniel felt the two adults who had shaped his life and defined his sense of family for so long crumble as he stared at them. Daniel finally uttered the brittle words, "Nobody lays a hand on my mother." He stood up as if he had absorbed the heat of a blow and found renewed vitality in the pain. "You can't, Victor. She is." In a moment of both exposure and pleading, Phyllis turned to face Daniel. "I apologize," she said, using her name as a key to a room she had left unlocked for years. "I have no justification. I made an effort to keep you safe. I made a decision, and I believed it to be correct." Disbelief, rage, betrayal, and a childlike fear were all visible on Daniel's face. He muttered, "You lied to me," since that was all the voice would do, reduced to the most basic truth. Victor's expression was unreadable as he watched this empire unravel after witnessing hundreds of others. He stated, "It's a complicated matter. But let's stop lying." The Newman living room had never experienced such chaos and noise in the following hours. The phones rang. They called in legal experts. The authenticity of the papers was scanned. With her hands clenched around Phyllis's wrist, Nikki sat beside her. Daniel entered the hall by himself and leaned against the balustrade of the staircase, looking hollow and stunned, as though someone had asked him to take off a layer of himself and continue walking. Words seemed to have legs as it crawled outside the house. Genoa City feeds on revelations and thrives on secrets. When someone leaves a home with a secret, they always feel it trailing them like a shadow as they walk down the street. Victor had ordered the test, but why? The answer lingered in scars, an unsubstantiated rumor from years ago, an uneasy feeling in a man who had always detested being blind. Victor, ever the tactician, did not behave carelessly. He had a motive. Rumors about donor lists, whispers of will manipulation, a corrupt collection of documents that could be used to gain influence. He had been protective of the empire he had established, and the order he believed was required to maintain it, rather than just being paternal. Beyond the business chessboard, however, there were repercussions. In a matter of minutes, Daniel's identity began to fade. He had grown up with a man who sang him lullabies, argued baseball lines, and loved him as a son. A different genetic script was now suggested by the lab results. The remainder of the week was devoted to meticulous choreography. Victor had the lab stamp. DNA had been completed. Disgusted and humiliated, Phyllis maintained that she had no malicious intent. In private, Daniel yelled at her, using dangerous and immature language. Jack attempted to step in by offering protection and legal advice. Victoria, who was always the first to consider the optics, expressed her concerns out loud about how this would affect Daniel's future, the public's opinion, and the company's stock. Above all, Daniel felt empty, like a bell that had been struck too forcefully. He wasn't sure which hand, the one the lab had abruptly thrust into his life or the one he'd known all these years. He would prefer to hold his truth. He was sitting in a diner in town when he saw waves of light from passing cars spill across the table like a grudging response. His phone was ringing with messages from friends wondering, Jack being protective, and Diane begging. He set down the phone and inhaled until his breathing became less labored. In private, Phyllis attempted to explain what had motivated her. Fear. Fear that a child would be swallowed by the Numa machine. Fear that Victor would take the boy away. And fear that any truth would cause Daniel more harm than a lie that would put him to sleep. Later, when he and Phyllis confronted each other away from the family, Victor remarked, "You thought you were sparing him pain. In your protective humbug, you turned him into a pawn." Even Victor was taken aback by her defiant yet tearful response. "I made a choice to give him a life. I didn't bring him into your world." Victor said, "You deprived him of the right to know his blood. That isn't defense. That is theft." The media moved like a pack as soon as they smelt the story. Victor made a succinct, formal statement that was presented as one man's obligation to the truth. In a written apology, Phyllis attempted to balance love and guilt. At first, Daniel refrained from making any public remarks. He had to remain silent as the headlines swarmed like wasps. Shocks, however, have gravity. Loyalty was shattered by the confession in ways that no single statement could undo. In support of corporate governance and transparency, some people joined Victoria's cause. Others questioned whether the announcement had been strategic, given Victor's long history of using the truth as a scalpel. Was Victor just a man claiming a possible heir for himself? Would this result in disputes over guardianship, recalculations of inheritance, and a lifetime of being torn between Romulatus and Newmans? When the world needed noise, Daniel, who had always tried to keep quiet, had to deal with a new noise. The notion that not only had his past changed, but that his future might be in jeopardy. Birthdays, and a man who had reared him, a man who had always been more father than blood, came to mind. He recalled Victor's voice and how, for many years, Victor had been the standard by which everything was judged. The lab results were merely on paper. The living, breathing moments were where the pain was felt. Phyllis and Daniel sat on the old couch in her apartment in a private moment that felt like a brief truce. The couch had once held whispered secrets, ragged laughter, and the weight of a woman trying to be loved for more than her schemes. Her voice broke as she said, "I thought I was doing right. I believed I was keeping you safe." Daniel questioned, "How could you keep it? How did you determine that was acceptable?" She muttered, "I wanted you to have a life. I didn't want Victor to be involved in every choice. This is not what I wanted your world to be." Like a man who had been asked to cut his own reflection, he glanced at her and then away. "Phyllis, I'm not sure how to handle this. The man who reared me is someone I adore. I'm not sure how I feel about blood. The harshest aspect of revelations is that they don't give you the next step. Instead, you have to come up with it." Daniel knew he didn't have to respond immediately. He could choose the name he wanted to go by, set up his own DNA confirmation, and take the time to find out the truth. He believed that he could also determine what love meant independently of heredity. Victor's expression was like a map unrolling as he observed all of this. Though the victory felt like glass, he had won a truth. He had bruised a family member by striking a hand too loudly. He sat in his study late at night and considered the price of being correct. But he didn't apologize because that wasn't his personality. The narrative did not end smoothly, because nothing that comes into contact with blood stays private for very long in a town like Genoa City. There were court filings. Testimonials regarding Phyllis's intentions were available. In certain interviews, Daniel remained silent and listened to his life's natural reorganization. Months passed after weeks. The initial shock subsided into the clumsy, slow process of adjustment. In the end, Daniel asked for a separate paternity test to verify Victor's claims. The results supported Victor's assertions. That did not immediately bring families back together, nor did it take away his affection for the man who had raised him. Rather, it introduced an additional layer. A man who was both Romilati and Newman in ways that required the reconciliation of law and heart. People learned small, difficult lessons in the quiet that followed the storm, such as the distinction between cruelty and truth, the harm caused by paternalism, and how one decisive action can close doors and open uncomfortable new ones. By tearing away a veil, Victor had turned into a tool of suffering and what he believed to be justice. One evening, Daniel was sitting on the Newman terrace with his hair being slowly blown by the wind. He pondered whether names were keys or cages as he gazed at the city that had once been his home. Newman blood had presented him with a fresh opportunity, but it came at a price he had not requested. He did not yet know what he would do with it. For the time being, he gave himself permission to experience feelings of betrayal, bewilderment, and a place where identity was a map that he would have to recreate using his own hands rather than a single word.